Dr. Jason Roop, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for having me. It's truly an honor to be here. And so I follow your work, have followed it for quite a while, and I'm excited about this discussion we're about to have.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I know I think we actually probably met through LinkedIn, which is where I run into so many folks doing interesting work and innovative work, which is why I thought it would be fantastic to have you on to do an episode because you are doing the incredibly challenging job of trying to forge a new path. You've designed a new model of recovery that you call the trait-based model of recovery, and you found some successes, but it's new, I think, to most people who are listening today. And so I was thinking maybe we could start with the basics. Tell us a little bit about your model, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, all right. Well, the trait-based model recovery is something, Aaron, that I created, and it's in a nutshell, as far as an overview, it's a model of empowerment. It's strength-based, it's trauma-informed, and it moves to empower people by focusing on these traits that research suggests that people with substance use disorder commonly possess. These leadership traits as opposed to just addressing, the shortcomings or the behaviors. What trait-based does is it considers the whole person and gets underneath the surface and examines life through the lens of these traits. And so we work with traits like resilience, self-awareness, and empathy, and it's 100% accessible online. It's got a trait assessment with it. It's a valid instrument to assess which leadership traits that our clients or students have or possess the strongest. Additionally, we've got archetypes, so heroes of recovery or heroes of prevention. But in a nutshell, 40 lessons, trait-based model recovery. Every lesson has a video, a lesson summary, activities, questions for discussions or reflection. And yeah, we launched it about 18 months ago, Aaron, and already we've been implemented across 18 organizations in 5 states.
Yeah, well, and I don't think it's a mistake that that's happening. I think that folks can recognize when something's working and when something resonates. But I want to take us back to where you started in the description about leadership traits, because I know that historically speaking, substance use problems, addiction, it's been pretty heavily stigmatized. I think that there's a lot of looking down upon that folks do for folks who are struggling with these sorts of problems. And so I'd imagine that the idea of like going at leadership traits is something that might seem counterintuitive for some, and maybe even for some of the people going through it, because addiction can be an extremely humbling experience to go through, to be stuck inside. So could you explain a little bit about how these traits manifest and why you took it in that direction?
Well, I have to go back to my personal story. I was in active addiction for 17 years. I've been arrested 18 times. I've overdosed 4 times. I've been raided by the police twice. And ultimately, in 2012, I wound up in a homeless shelter. And then, fortunately, in 2013, I went to treatment, and I was in a residential treatment program for a solid year. And what I noticed while I was there, Aaron, like quite honestly, when I showed up to the front doors for treatment, I felt like a monster. I felt just like an absolute nuisance to society. And the very best thing that I could do was just to get out of the way. And when I went into treatment, there were a lot of other people that felt just like I did. However, while I was there, I noticed that a lot of great good was being accomplished. Like there were some pretty amazing things going on inside the walls of that facility that people weren't talking about. I just seen a lot of great effort. I seen guys convincing other clients to not leave treatment, to stay committed to the recovery path. I seen community efforts going out, like volunteerism out in the community. There, people were forming study groups. Several clients went on to get an advanced degree in education or in the field, and they would go on to become community leaders. So that stuck with me. And then in 2019, I began pursuing my PhD, and I always came back for the research question to this one question. And it was this: when we talk about recovery, is the whole purpose to overhaul someone completely from the inside out, top to bottom, left to right, or are there some good qualities or something that we can pull forward and build upon? And so, from my lived experience and what I observed, my hypothesis was that people with substance use disorder possess highly effective leadership traits. And the reason that is and there was nothing in the literature at the time, so I had to do a lot of heavy lifting and piecing together a lot of these dimensions. But the reason that people don't often correlate the two subgroups together, substance use disorder and leadership, is just because the way these traits exhibit or demonstrate themselves in active addiction. So let's just take empathy, for example. Empathy is the number one leadership trait, and it's the ability to connect very deeply to someone else. I know you know this, but it's separate from sympathy. Well, that, according to the research, is present in the life of someone who's in active addiction commonly. Now, we're not saying 100%, but most commonly. However, because addiction has been introduced, what the addiction or substance use disorder does is it manipulates that trait of empathy. So in active addiction, we can walk into a room. I remember I was able to walk into any social setting, and I could scan the room and I could connect with someone that I thought might be like-minded, that could help me get the drug of my choice. So what empathy does, like, we have that ability to connect, but addiction hijacks that, and we objectify the other person and manipulate them to get what we want. So people on the outside looking in says, well, people in addiction are highly manipulative, and of course we don't stereotype, but I'll admit, like, we do make some decisions and behaviors that can be perceived as manipulative, but the underlying truthfulness of this is that without that foundation of empathy, the manipulation would not be nearly as effective. And so we go through all 10 of the traits that we work with, the trait-based model. And it's the traits that people with substance use disorder commonly possess, although it's exhibited in their shadow form. And so those traits are resilience, empathy, tenacity, determination, appreciation, motivational, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and creativity. So yes, it is a game changer. And you mentioned, like, even it's a hard uptake for clients. And the reason we've applied this or implemented trait-based across all levels of care, from that acute withdrawal phase all the way down to outpatient and drug courts, and it's having efficacy across all levels. So what we're learning from the clients is that typically a lot of people have been to treatment multiple times, and it's a lot of redundancy. When you go to treatment, there's certain curriculum that you're going to find present in other places, and it kind of it kind of keeps us in that mode or in that pattern. But what clients are sharing is that when they learn this information and this knowledge, that it evaporates that shame and that stigma, and clients are walking around, or walking around with a sense of dignity and self-respect, hope and purpose. So it's a bit of a teaser for a lot of
Mm.
people to say, hey, people in addiction possess uh, or highly effective leadership traits. But in all actuality, that's very, very true. And it's a specific type of leader. It's a transformational leader that people in addiction often exude those traits and those skills.
Mhm. Well, I appreciate you saying that, like, even for folks in it might feel a little bit like a tease. Like, what do you mean? I'm feeling incredibly low. I'm showing up
Mhm.
for treatment, perhaps at a facility, or even if it's more of like a self-guided program. But that takes a certain level of humility to acknowledge that there's a problem going on, and it might be very difficult to then look at that and say, well, what traits do I have, or even have I trained myself? Like, what skills have I gained through this process that maybe I've applied
Mhm.
to ends that have not been furthering my life or furthering society. But if we took those
Mhm.
approaches and put them differently, if we redirected them towards something positive, where could you go? And it sounds like what you're saying is you found the answers actually pretty far.
Hmm. Yeah, that's it exactly. And so what the curriculum is designed in a way, it's delivered over 8 modules. Each module has 5 lessons, and so The title of that first module is Who Am I? And so we feel like that's such a foundational question for all of us to answer, really, like who we really are, right? And so we realize through the trait based model that we are more than a label. We're more than a disease. We're more than a disorder. We're not bad. And so we drop all those labels. And through the process of understanding how our shadow traits have been used, often what we say that really connects with the clients is the very same traits, the very same stuff that got you into trouble can become the very same stuff to lead you out of that trouble. And so it delivers, in that first module, Who Am I? Clients are saying the restraints are taken off. It's this mentality previously leading up to trait based that would suggest to oneself that, well, I can only hope to or aspire to maybe be sober for a certain time period, but I'm not going to be able to get my family back. I'm not going to be able to work in the career I want. I'm not going to be able to continue and advance my education. And what trait based says is like we can take off some of those self-limiting phrases and terminology and begin to consider a world of opportunity and possibilities. And it's not like clients have to go and purchase these traits. You couldn't purchase them. It's an inherent quality that they possess, and these dynamic qualities have just been manipulated, used, and hijacked by addiction. And so it comes across as something other than leadership. Look, I was arrested 18 times, but never once did an arrest lead me to stop getting high because I'm resilient. I would get back up after I've been knocked down. And of course, that's a poor expression of resilience or a destructive expression of resilience, but it's still resilience. And so that's
Mhm.
what we're latching on to across all of these
Right.
traits and then building from that.
Right. Well, I appreciate you giving that last example because it's true, right? Like I
Mhm.
think a lot of folks would look at that like 17 times, uh, like why can't he learn? But that's not actually what it's about, right? It's about in your mind when you're in active addiction. This is what you need to do. This is what's important to you,
Yeah.
and nothing's going to stop you. But you put that in a positive direction. Imagine how far it takes you.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned though, so resilience is one of those 10 traits, and I know particularly because this is a podcast. Most folks are listening to this. It's tough to keep 10 things in mind, but I know that you've grouped them in three separate categories. Can you talk a little bit about those categories and how they all interplay?
Yeah, and it's really one of the coolest things. I always love to share about this or speak about this, but there is a way that these traits can be grouped that provide an emotional framework to navigate the recovery journey or all of life. So out of all 10 traits, they can be grouped in such a way that gives us a place to stand. So there's the grit traits. That's going to be determination, tenacity, and resilience. All are so very closely associated. Determination, moving forward in spite of opposition, tenacity, standing firm in spite of the force that comes against you. And by the way, a shadow expression of tenacity is denial. It's like when somebody comes, and I'm speaking from lived experience, whenever someone say, Jason, you need help, you need to go to treatment, you've got a problem, I would reject that. I would be tenacious and not budging an inch, saying, I don't need to go to treatment. I don't have a problem. You have a problem. And so that's just reflective of another demonstration of these grit traits: resilience, determination, tenacity. And then on the other side, you've got the grace traits. And those traits are empathy, appreciation, and motivational. And all of those traits deal with relationships or relatability. So if you can imagine kind of like a three-pronged path with a path down the middle, one on the left side and one on the right side. And down the middle are those balance traits. So you've got grit on the left, grace on the right, and down the middle you've got the balance traits, which are self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and creativity. And we provide this, and this is illustrated through the tree of traits, which clients obviously they have access to. It's in all of our guidebooks and our videos. But these traits, when grouped in such a way as this, provide three things for us. And number one, it helps us to achieve inner balance and harmony. Number two, it can serve as a problem solving tool. And number three, It can be used as a leadership development tool. And here's what I mean. I'll explain how this works. So in April 2023, I was submitted a proposal to present on the trait-based model recovery at the RX Summit in Atlanta. Now I got accepted, and I'm preparing for the presentation, and I show up down there, and I just had the research from my dissertation and some early research beyond that, and I had the idea of the trait-based model recovery, but I didn't have a guidebook, I didn't have a curriculum, I didn't have videos, I didn't have an assessment, I didn't have anything. And so at that breakout session, I'm sharing about the trait-based model recovery, and it really resonates with people. Like all across that room, people were excited, and when it came up for the Q&A part of the presentation, like people lined up from the microphone, and they were lined up to the back of the room, and it was really very, very busy and it was a very exciting atmosphere. And I was elated, I was happy. And then the first person that came up to the microphone said, Dr. Roop, we love the trait-based model recovery. When can we get our hands on it? And Aaron, part of the trait-based model, one of the phases is entrepreneurial opportunities, because in active addiction, many of us have had to be entrepreneurialistic. I know that I did. Often I'd wake up with no money at all, but I'd find a way to somehow get money, and using entrepreneurial skills. For example, I owned a power washing company for a period of about 5 days. So it's just kind of reflective of this ingenuity and innovativeness. So anyway, when I was asked, when can we get our hands on it? I knew I shouldn't say, well, I don't know, I don't have anything. So I leaned into the mic and said the first thing that came to my mind. I said 90 days. And so I came back to Kentucky and went to work. I started writing the curriculum, writing the guidebooks, doing all of these continuous studies on the assessment to make sure the scales held together, and doing the videos. I ordered a camcorder. I didn't even know if they still made camcorders, but they do, by the way. And so I'm building the trait-based model recovery, and I'm working 16, 18-hour days. One evening I come home, and my wife Amanda says to me, Jason, where's your joy? And I said, what do you mean? She said, you're normally very happy, very lighthearted. You're smiling, but recently you've just been so stressed out. You've just been so tense. She said, I can see it on your face. It's just, you're very, very tight. And she said this, she said, don't you know that the trait-based model recovery must be built with love? And Aaron, when she said that, it was like a light came on. It was an epiphany for me. It was that trait of self-awareness, right? When she said that, it caused me to become self-aware. And I was like, you know what? You're right. You're exactly right. And she's always right, by the way. And so what I was able to do in that moment, I had gotten so lost. So if we've got a three-pronged path, I was using my grit traits, my resilience, determination, and tenacity, because I score highly on those. I was lost down that path. Even though I was doing something good that was going to help a lot of people, I was way out of balance. I was neglecting grace. I was neglecting the relationships, the relatability, the rest that's so necessary and important in life. And quite frankly, Aaron, I was as close to a relapse during that time as I've ever been. Even though I was doing something good, something worthwhile, I was so out of balance and so stressed out that I was in dangerous territory. But when Amanda said that, I was able to come back to the path of balance. And the way that we use this for clients in this framework and this understanding is anytime you get lost, self-awareness is going to be your guiding light home. And so we promote mindfulness and meditation, with clients for just small periods frequently throughout the day to check in to see how they're doing emotionally and psychologically. And if somebody gets lost down the grace path, it can happen just as well. But remember, those traits are empathy, appreciation, and motivational. Well, all those traits deal with relatability and other people. But when somebody gets lost down the grace path, it's because they've lost their identity into the drama of another person. And there's no judgment in trait based. We don't label actions as defective or parts of ourselves as defective, which is another reason that trait based is so transformative. But if someone goes and gets lost down the path of grace, they've been, first of all, compelled by compassion or love, but because they're out of balance, they often become codependent or become people pleasers. And so self-awareness is that anchor that brings us home. And then when we've done that, right, when we've practiced this a few times, we then are cultivating emotional intelligence. And then when we've cultivating this emotional intelligence, we're understanding who we are. We then can use that trait of authenticity to be our authentic selves, because quite honestly, up to that point, many of us have been wearing masks. We fragment ourselves. We call certain parts of ourselves defective, or we try to push away certain parts that are undesirable and put forward the parts that we think everybody likes and oppress everyone. And it initiates this internal war that will never ever win. And so, what trait based does is it considers the whole person, right? Acknowledges all of our shadows, all of our light, accepts it, and then simply it integrates it, and then learning to use our traits in a positive fashion moving forward. The other two ways that the tree of traits can be used is for effective problem solving. We use this in the prevention model, a 4-step process that begins with self awareness and emotional intelligence, authenticity, and leads to creativity, finding creative solutions for problems. And then finally, leadership development. What trait based delivers in terms of leadership development is transformative leadership. All we're doing is highlighting these superpowers within the lives of people, and then just adding strength to that, or resources to that, awareness to that. And what emerges is incredible influence capacities, so this emotional intelligence, authenticity. And so clients are actually learning that leadership is not just a title, it's not a position. Leadership is influence, and we have the ability to influence others, starting with ourselves every day.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that is a lot to absorb. And I know you mentioned the tree of traits. You sent me that infographic a little while, that has that all outlined, and maybe we can make that available, somewhere along the way too, to listeners, so that they can conceptualize it a little bit better. But it does. I know that when you first were talking to me about this, one of the aspects that really appealed to me was that it's very intuitive. Again, it's a lot to remember if you're just hearing it for the first time, with 3 paths and 10 different things. But actually, like, the more you look at it, the more you think of it, it just resonates. And I think that's probably why it's caught on so well. I'm curious though, in terms of coming up with those 10 traits, in those three clusters or branches, if you will. What was your process of developing those? Was that something where it's just you were asking, it was like focus groups? Was it looking at previous literature around strengths
Yeah.
based work and leadership development? Like,
Yeah.
how did you come up with that model?
Well, it's really exciting. I feel like I've always known. I think most people have known, when we're talking about this demographic or this community. At least from my lived experience, there's something that kind of sets us apart that we haven't quite had the terminology for. And I think that what trait based does is it delivers that. And so the process for arriving at those traits, when I was first doing the initial research, I was included in the participant pool were a lot of people from diverse backgrounds. So I carried out a qualitative methodology that included interviews, focus groups, observations, field notes, and I came away with over 1 million themes. And I had some peers, some fellow researchers who did not have a personal history of addiction, because obviously I'm going to be biased. I'm going to say, yeah, of course, people in addiction are great leaders, but I actually had 3 other committee members to verify that I was analyzing and coding the data correctly. And so I had over 2 dozen themes. One of the things, like post traumatic growth, that's one of them. Breaking the rules was a theme, which offers a profound, I'm sure, very interesting insight if we ever had the time to fully explore that. But out of those themes, I knew that we needed to distill it down into something accessible, tangible, and easily understood. And so all of those themes, I then correlated those or coded those onto these traits, because these themes were emerging at a root level from these traits. And so that's how I arrived to the 10 traits. And then how I got the tree of traits, well, quite honestly, I really didn't have the intention of creating an emotional framework, but I was deep in meditation one night, and It just appears. I know that sounds as crazy and unscientific as can be, but I'm just going to be transparent and honest about it. The tree of traits just kind of was divinely inspired, you could say. And actually, I seen the symbology, the diagram, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper. And in fact, I showed it to my wife Amanda to say, does this make sense to you? And she's like, oh yeah, absolutely, of course. So I just stuck with it, spent some time with it, and then it began to reveal this roadmap for how we can navigate life and achieve and sustain this inner balance and harmony.
I think that's marvelous. You know, I think a lot. Sometimes I use sports metaphors in my work and just thinking about how to understand certain concepts and ideas. And I know that reading the book and watching the movie of Moneyball really made me think a lot about, you know, you've got like the scouts and you've got the like what do you see, the anecdote, and then you also have the hard numbers and the analysis. And it strikes me that you're saying you got to this result by first doing the really rigorous qualitative in this case
Yep. Yep.
methodology,
Mm.
and then you kind of let that percolate.
Yep.
You gave yourself space to be present and think, and then
Yep.
you had a flash of insight. And I
Yeah.
think that's oftentimes how the best ideas come about.
Yeah, I agree. It's been the coolest thing. Like it is absolutely the one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. How that was delivered and how it's been brought into the world. It's special. Very, very special.
Yeah, well, so you brought it into the world, you gave birth to it, and now it's starting to get some legs. It's maybe in the toddler phase right now. And I know something else that really appealed to me at our first conversation was you were talking about how, you know, it was born out of empirical rigor, but you're collecting data, and you think, you know, it's one thing to feel like you've got a good idea or something that's theoretically works, and then it's another to actually collect some data along the way and validate it and say, no, this does work,
Yeah.
and I can point to these studies and show how. So how's it looking? So like, what have you seen so far in the data
Oh,
you're collecting?
yeah. It's really, really profound, and I could have never predicted this level of success. With trait based, I always knew that when I was creating the trait based model recovery, that this understanding would be very impactful in a prevention setting. And so and we can talk maybe about that later. But as far as the data that's being kept, we're keeping data on our prevention efforts, but we are actually reporting and soon to be published a longitudinal study where we took 139 trait based clients that were in those levels of care at one of our partner sites or an organization like residential treatment or IOP, intensive outpatient. And so what was discovered in this longitudinal study is that we use, of course, the trait assessment, our very own proprietary trait assessment and hero of the recovery journey assessment, along with the GAD-7 for anxiety and the PHQ-9 for depression. And what was revealed is that across the board, the trait-based intervention was able to successfully decrease levels of depression by 71.5% and levels of anxiety by 58.5%. And another pleasant surprise is when we started analyzing the data. And again, I had other researchers to verify that the statistical computations and analysis were being carried out effectively. But what we also learned was the retention rates for trait based was 97.1%. And this wasn't a randomized trial. We didn't want to create any hardships in those treatment setting communities. For example, saying, okay, this group of people, they can get in trait based. You guys, sorry about your luck. We didn't want to create that dynamic. So we didn't do a randomized trial, but we just followed our clients. And what we learned is we started with 139 clients, and the control group, which would be those clients that are going through traditional programming, some of the most commonly used curriculum and programming, and we followed their success or their progress. Well, the control group started with 425 clients. And then in 60 days, that control group had dropped down to 132. And then after 90 days, they were left with 66. So they started with 425. After 3 months, there's only 66 remaining. Trait based starts with 139, and after 3 months, we have 135. And I almost that's such a profound difference. And here's why this is so very important. We know that the longer you can stay in treatment, the greater your chances of saving lives, of having life transformation. And so the trait based content is so engaging that it is drawing out, you can say, the intentionality of clients because it's increasing their dignity and their self respect and their hope for the future. And so that's
Mm.
really, really profound numbers that we're seeing
Yeah.
come across. Every client we keep data on, we do those assessments, anxiety, depression, as well as the trait assessment. And we've got on the back end recovery capital, the RCS 36 that we'll be using. And there's so much we can do to analyze these traits. Like we can
Mhm.
continue more studies to see what specific traits may be correlated to specific substances and then what modalities may be most effective for those. So it's really, we're born and bred in research and we're saturated in research. And fortunately, what we're
Yeah.
seeing, the research is really kind of supporting the efficacy of the trait based model.
Yeah, I love to hear how you're already starting to think, all right, well, so as we collect more data, have more perhaps manpower even to do the research as time goes on, what directions do you want to go in and what insights could that bring? I think so. So a point that I wanted to bring up and talk about is that it is so difficult, even with compelling data like this, or even as it gets more robust, it's so challenging sometimes to get uptake on new methods of doing things. And particularly in the addiction and recovery world, there's a really strong bent of traditionalism. Although, to be honest, I think just behavioral health in general, I think a lot of us would have a very hard time. Like I was trained very closely in a cognitive behavioral model. Um, I don't know if there would ever come a time when either CBT became obsolete or if it was just something where it seemed like I would really be better served doing some intensive training in some sort of, like fifth wave, sixth wave therapy,
Mhm.
somewhere along the way, because it's just that much better. I think a lot of times there's a lot of investment into sticking with what we know, and sometimes even just a lot of loyalty
Mhm.
if we've seen that it's helped people in the past.
Mhm.
I'm wondering what your experience has been
Mhm.
moving into that area where you're saying like, hey, like I'm not saying that what you're doing is wrong or bad, and
Mhm.
I've got something different to present to you, but change is tough. So how's that been so far, and what's your experience been with that?
I mean, I love that question because I was fully aware that there are some sacred cows when it comes to the recovery community, and I always am very mindful to not speak poorly or negatively about any other approach. But I knew that there would be some well entrenched adherence to traditional modalities, and so one of the things that we approach this with is to say, hey, we're not in competition. We want to complement what you've already done so well, but we can add to it. And additionally, trait based can also stand on its own. And so I think having lived experience in active addiction, I was able to see what some of these traditional approaches delivered and the outcomes of that. I remember being in residential treatment and we were doing great things. Like I mentioned earlier, study groups. We
Yeah.
were helping people to remain in treatment and we were building our lives back together, but we participated in the gold standard for treatment that was here in Kentucky. It's the substance abuse programming, and every day we would get in a circle and just pick each other apart, picking out every incorrect thing that they'd done, if they missed a chore, if they had a bad attitude, and it would go around to everybody. And quite honestly, by the time those meetings were over, we just felt trashed. We were completely just honestly, maybe not everyone 100%, but most often, most people just felt really kind of belittled in a way, or at least thin in a way of imagining their future. So there's room for growth in the field in those contexts already. So what we were able to do with trait base, we first speak to that lived experience, like we know what it's like to be on the inside. And then we know that rigidity, a lot of times those traditional approaches, those communities, and sometimes, and not everyone, but they have certain languages and coded words, you can say, a group talk that for someone just approaching for the first time may feel like an outsider. And so we wanted to relax that rigidity, which I think offers space to remove some self-limiting beliefs. And so we focus on empowering clients, right? We focus on community building. And so with the data too, Aaron, that's so instrumental. Like we have the data to share that shows our outcomes. And, it is very much, people are more, what I have learned is that the decision makers in these organizations are more open to considering something new, a new approach, if it's, of course, backed by the data. So we had that, and we emphasize that's probably paramount. That's probably fundamental to helping us get into the door. But additionally, we emphasize empowerment. And so this we emphasize empowerment over the pathology because we oftentimes we don't see the good parts of ourselves. We are well connected to our failures, to our poor decision making skills, but we don't see the good qualities within. And so when you begin to equip and empower people to see that, it really is a game changer. And Aaron, I've got facilitators that are facilitating trait based. Some of the people, some of the guys, they've been in 12 steps for 30, 35 years. And it's
Hmm.
not like, you've got to choose one or the other. That's not the way it's set up. Again, it can be very complementary, but we've got facilitators that
Yeah.
love to engage clients on this level. And, it really, I think
Mhm.
the data, the lived experience, and our approach it has a lot of momentum with it. There's a lot of truthfulness with it. And it's
Yeah.
really, really catching on like fire.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great point. You're not just the creator, but also probably the best messenger imaginable because you've been there and you have that lived experience. I do not. I speak about addiction a lot. I talk about it, but I haven't been inside, and that means that there's certain ways of relating to the idea and even credibility, I'd say sometimes that I just won't have because I haven't been inside of it. But you have, and that lens, that extra piece. I
Mhm.
really like also what you were saying about the idea of complementary rather than replacing or making something into a competition.
Yeah, yeah.
I talk about I do mental wellness seminars or webinars sometimes with companies, and when I talk about positive psychology and the place it has, things like gratitude, for example, and uh, positive self-talk, these sorts of things,
Mhm.
I put up a little continuum of mood from like an unhappy face to a happy face, right? And
Mhm. Mhm.
to represent that on that negative side of the continuum is usually when people come to therapy, what they're wanting to work on. They've got addiction, they've got depression or anxiety or symptoms of traumatic stress,
Mhm.
and a lot of treatment modalities focus on removing the negative.
Mhm.
Uh, but that might only get you up to 0 out of
Mhm.
10. If it's
Mhm.
like from -10 to 10, that might get you to 0 or 2. But like, what if you want to
Mhm.
thrive?
Mhm.
What if you wanted to be at like a 4, 5, 6, 7 in mood? Well, you probably have to add in some positive as well. You can't just be subtracting negative. And
Yeah.
it seems like that's that space that trait based can occupy. It's
Yeah,
got some positive psychology elements to it.
it does indeed, and I agree wholeheartedly with you. And a couple things about that is what we've learned. I think as a society is like whatever we focus on, we give attention to, and whatever we give attention to, we give energy to. So I know just from past experience, like for most of my life, I was trying to get rid of these neuroses or these obsession or this pride or this selfishness, and it would just get worse. And so, of course, we consider the whole person when it comes to this approach, and then, of course, it lends itself to first of all considering the whole person, and then beyond that, it's that ability to build, like you said, on those positives, to go to the winning side, so to speak, that we can cultivate these traits and use them. When we consider the whole person, what we discover is something so very profound, and it delivers this dignity with it. That really helps people to perform, helps them to roll out in these leadership capacities that they never otherwise thought that they were even capable of achieving. So yeah, it's a very impactful approach, and yes, I want to
Mhm.
say this as well. You said something that reminded me, Aaron. So in trait module two, module two is called the Shadowlands. And so when and some of this is derived or birthed in Jungian psychology, but not in a very clinical or a very rigid understanding. The way that trait based understands shadows is, of course, it's the shadow representation of these leadership traits. So clients are able to do some self inventory, making amends, and to examine their previous behavior, not through the lens of defective character, but through the lens of shadow traits. And then what we do to promote wholeness is to say, okay, we're not going to try to annihilate these shadows. You can't. Anytime you have light, you're going to have a shadow. And our whole purpose is to just integrate, accept, acknowledge, and then move forward using these traits in a positive fashion.
Yeah. Well, I think there's just so many fascinating. I think the best new creations are ones that are able to integrate existing ideas that people understand or come intuitively. And like, I hear you saying, so let's draw on some Jungian psychology, but not necessarily
Uh,
clinically.
yeah.
And let's not divorce parts of the self. Because as you were saying, it's that sort of thing where people say, well, you don't think about elephants, you're going to think about elephants. Well, maybe it's not so much about uh, trying to eradicate certain parts of yourself. Maybe it's about learning to understand it. Maybe that leans more into like mindfulness or acceptance and
Mhm.
some act sort of techniques there.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really pulling the best of a number of different places together
Yeah.
to create something new,
Yeah.
like baking a cake.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We wanted to include, because we all we do is just advance the great work that's already being carried out. All of this dynamic, incredibly resourceful and effective approaches. Yeah, we did want to draw upon what's working, and draw upon what we think is helpful to form something that is innovative and that is new, but it is embedded in some of those well substantiated understandings of the human being.
Yeah, yeah. Iterative. So much of progress is building one on top of another.
Yeah.
So question though, earlier you were telling the story about when you were first coming up with your materials, and people were asking, how do I get my hands on it? You're like 90 days. I know we've talked a lot today about utilization of this either in, say, like prevention programs or in treatment programs. I'm wondering though, like if someone is listening to this and thinking, like I might be interested in maybe doing this in my practice, or maybe even someone's listening and thinking this might be useful for me. Like
Mhm.
maybe me or someone I love. Do they have to go through like a treatment program who's using the curriculum, or is there a way for them to engage with it just as an individual or an individual practitioner?
Yeah, there is. And I'm so glad you asked that. The timing is perfect. We originally, when we first rolled this out, Aaron, we were only doing it at those treatment providers, and starting out with residential. And then we went ILP, then outpatient. And we've partnered with the Albuquerque, New Mexico pretrial diversion team through their district attorney's office. They're using trait based as part of the pretrial diversion program. And then, of course, with prevention, we're now in schools. So you're asking about if anyone is interested, they want to use this. We do have a pathway for private practitioners to use this with your clients, and I would just suggest sending me an email, and we'll carry on the conversation. But it works really well in that setting, in the private practice, because all the clients have the content. It can be an app on your phone, and then they meet with their therapist, however frequently they do, to discuss the content. So there's a lot of ways to structure it. Trait based is very, very flexible, very, very adaptable. It's really amazing. It has fit into the context or the levels of care across the board uniquely and just as effectively in all of those scenarios. So, yes, to answer the question, absolutely. If someone wants to reach out to me as a private practice, we'll be glad to issue the license and go through the training. There's facilitator training, and then onboard and implement the program through their services.
Is there a self-guided version as well, though, for someone who's just interested in doing it, or does it require to be like a facilitation by
Yeah,
somebody?
I do, Aaron, because if someone's in active addiction, we're not going directly to the client right now. We're going
Hmm.
kind of like B2B. So we're working with. I want to work with those organizations that have case management therapists that provide the medical care. I think starting there has been good, and as we learn and grow this out, I do envision
Yeah,
at some point being able to offer this directly to people once we have in place those online facilitators. I want to pair clients up with a facilitator to help lead them and guide them. And another thing
yeah,
I wanted to mention is that clients have loved trait based so much, and we don't want to just give them a certificate, say, "Oh, great job. We wish you the best of luck moving forward." That's not it. We want to sustain this platform for the rest of their lives. So, a couple things: clients always have access to trait base. If they go through it today and they leave treatment after 20 days or 30 days, and then 6 months down the road, they think of something, they want to somehow get access to the content, we'll allow that. And I'm sure that may come back to bite me at some point, but honestly, I don't really care because I think it's really important. So, two stories
yeah.
really, really quickly. I had a client in Albuquerque. He's part of the Albuquerque pretrial diversion program, and we've had multiple people through that location asked to go back through trait base. They want to repeat it. They want to be able to, as a group, go back, which I think may be the first time people have asked to go back through rehab again. But it's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
And then additionally, here in Kentucky, clients really appreciated and enjoyed and were engaged with trait based so much that they actually kept asking me, we want to have an in-person weekly meeting for trait based graduates. So we've started that. It's called the Start from Strength Ambassadors Club. So right here in Central Kentucky, in Danville, Kentucky, at Altogether Recovery, clients or who are former trait-based clients and graduated from trait-based still come to meet weekly to discuss inner work, leadership development, connecting to community, and that continues to grow. And so ideally, we're going to have a Start from Strength Ambassadors Club in every state, in every area where we have the trait-based model being implemented.
That sounds amazing. No, I appreciate the candor about how
Mhm.
right now we're not you're not going directly to
Mhm.
someone who's in an active addiction and why. You want it to be successful and it's most successful when it's facilitated.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see where this all goes, not just on the research front, but
Mhm.
uh, the themes of hope and inspiration come through really strongly when you talk about your work. And when I
Mhm.
think about folks who are stuck deep in it, and I know you know this because you've been there, like that's what sometimes they need more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that if someone could get this information, and not everybody, of course, but there's gonna be certain people who hear this
Yeah.
and it gives them that vision of something different and something better.
Mhm.
And it's,
Mhm.
I know one step at a time. You gotta be pragmatic about it. You gotta make sure that you keep the structure. You
Yeah.
gotta make sure that as you scale up, it doesn't get diluted or
Right.
fragmented. But
Right.
I'm excited to see where you take this over time, and I know you're
Mhm.
just getting started.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. We've got, like I said, I always envisioned when I was creating the recovery model that prevention would be next, and I thought it'd be 5 years down the road. But actually, what happened last summer was a couple superintendents approached me and said, "We've heard your presentation on trait-based model recovery. Will you piece something together? Will you build a curriculum for prevention?" And I said 90 days. Yeah, but I did. I complied, and we actually launched our pilot here in Kentucky. And so our plans for the future, Aaron, we really want to be have as wide or as broad a reach as possible. So we'd like to see the recovery model and prevention model implemented in as many states as possible. It's very scalable. Trait based is is scalable, and so we want to grow those programs across the board. And what's planned to come down the road, we'll eventually want to have a modality that's trait based for family, so helping family members to identify the traits of their loved ones that may be in addiction, and how you can surround that and empower that and help to cultivate and develop those traits. And so we also have got a specialized focus, a modality for veterans, trait based for veterans, because there's a lot of these leadership traits that would harmonize for those in the military. And then, of course, for gambling, for process addiction. So we've got several pans in the fryer. I guess that's the same one of those. So we've got a lot of hands
Yeah.
in the kettle. Maybe, I don't know. I'm from Kentucky, so I don't know if this translates across the
It sounds
nation.
really painful.
It does. It does. Well,
I think it's like baskets in the fryer sounds safer,
oh,
but
that's
I know
better.
what
I'm
you're
like,
getting.
we'll go with
I know
basket.
what you're getting at.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's like
So
that's what the
yeah,
fries are cooked in, right? Um,
yes. So we've
well,
got
thank you for sharing that.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's really, really uh, it's really impactful. It just really, to think where I came from at one point in my life, just I'd given up all hope. Like I had destroyed every ounce of self respect and decency that I had. And honestly, Aaron, like I was ready to check out of this life here on earth at one point. And I thought that, I was in meth psychosis, and I thought I needed hospitalization, and I did. I would get treatment. But to imagine where I'm at today, it's just mind blowing. And I think it's for the purpose of sharing with somebody else that, you too can achieve more than perhaps what you're currently thinking. And so it's creating this understanding and this dynamic community within the trait based group that, man, we really have maybe sold ourselves short for most of our lives. But when we go underneath the surface, underneath the labels and all the terminology that's placed on us, and we follow the traits, what is illuminated is something pretty beautiful, something pretty resourceful, and something that is saturated in strength.
For words, Dr. Roop, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I think you're going to help a lot of people. I'm sure that on behalf of myself, Amanda, and everybody else, I'm glad you didn't check out all those years ago. I think there's a lot left to do in the world. It's going to be very positive. So thank you so much for sharing so much about trait based today. We'll have some links to some resources that you're able to share in the show notes as well as your website. But for those who are just listening, if folks want to learn more or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Yeah. So our website, you can visit our website at www.startfromstrength.org, or you can email me at jgroop, that's ROOP, at startfromstrength.org. jgroop at startfromstrength.org.
Well, thank you again. Appreciate your
Yeah.
time today. Thanks for
Yeah.
coming on.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very, very much.